Welcome back. Financial journalist and analyst Duma Gqubule says that the ruling ANC is paying lip service to transforming the ownership and indeed functionality of the South African Reserve Bank. Now, Gqubule says that some of the party's deployees in government have failed to implement previous party resolutions to this effect. Duma Gqubule is our guest this morning for I would say, a rather important discussion on the workings function of the Reserve Bank. So, Duma, thanks so much for coming through. Good morning.
Good morning. How are you, Sakina?
I'm very well, thanks. You know, I must say, when I came across the article, it was in the Mail and Guardian, and I kind of thought, this is something that we always talk about, we always opine about, but we never really take the time to just peel back the layers on the Reserve Bank in trying to understand exactly what this entity is comprised of, what its mandate is, you know, in very simple terms, getting to understand it.
I think 100%. And, you know, Sakina, the Reserve Bank is probably the most important institution in the country. Globally, over the past 15 years, we've seen the power of these central banks. You know, the response to the global financial crisis when they printed money for the first time in Western Reserve banks, and also after the COVID pandemic. The stimulus packages globally were about $16 trillion, the response to the COVID pandemic, 17% of GDP, world GDP, and many of these central banks, you know, they provided the magic money tree that was used to finance the response. In the United Kingdom, they financed 92% of the £350 response to the crisis. So what we've seen now globally is this separation between monetary and fiscal policy. It is crumbling, and people are beginning to see that monetary policy and fiscal policy shouldn't be separated in silos. And also, I think that ordinary South Africans must debate, as you're saying, this Reserve Bank. It's a powerful institution. The power to you know, create public money. Why should banks be the only ones have a monopoly over the creation of money? I've never understood that. Why does the government, when it needs to, you know, go to borrow money, why does it have to go to Standard Bank, Old Mutual, and do it on commercial terms when we have our Reserve Bank? So those are things that I think ordinary South Africans must start debating, ordinary ANC members. Why are we so scared of debating around this very important institution? Yeah.
Isn't it also because there is an impression or even an illusion created around the central bank such that, you know, we know nothing and therefore we are at their mercy to tell us what is good for us?
Yes, it's a mystique. And then also, like in South Africa, we've got this custom whereby the Reserve Bank uses one tool, interest rates, and it's got one target, inflation. Globally, that thing, it's not fit for purpose for a developing country like South Africa that needs to catch up to become a developed country in the next 2 decades or 3 decades. And it's not fit for purpose if you look at current practice of Reserve banks since the 2007 global financial crisis. What you're seeing now is that the separation, you know, Liz Truss in the UK, she's now used fiscal policy to address inflation. There are many ways of addressing inflation that don't just involve interest rate. And I think it's wrong for the Reserve Bank currently to be raising interest rate for what we call a supply side shock. So when they raise interest rates, it will make no difference to the inflation price. The price of when you raise interest rates, it's not going to stop the war in Ukraine or bring down the price of oil. Yeah.
And then we look at, for example, the African National Congress and their resolutions, their conference resolutions regarding the South African Reserve Bank. You go to 2012, you go to 2017, and the points are then reiterated that we need to look at the mandate of the Reserve Bank. But that's policy, and then the deployees in government, those who are in that particular sector, they don't seem to implement. What's the reason for that?
There's 4 things that we have to discuss. They're all unrelated. There's the ownership of the Reserve Bank. There's the mandate of the Reserve Bank. There's the the independence of the Reserve Bank and the composition of the Monetary Policy Committee. Now, the ownership of the Reserve Bank, the ANC in the last conference, they said it must be nationalized because there's an anomaly. There are only 7 other central banks throughout the world that have got private shareholders. And there's only 3 central banks in the world that are South Africa where there's no government shareholding. Those are Greece, Italy, and the US. So it is an anomaly. There is no other reason to nationalize. So I say, so that's what the ANC members said. Now, the ANC members in 2012 also said we need a flexible monetary policy that takes into account inflation, employment, growth. And then the one in 2017, they said the same thing. And then the 6th Policy Conference said the same thing. We need a flexible Reserve Bank. They added exchange rates, which I think is correct, because we are a mining country and we need to have a view on the exchange rate. So you've had all these resolutions, and the ANC deployees in government, they find ways to circumvent internal democracy, and they never provide an explanation as to why they can't implement resolution after resolution around the ownership of the Reserve Bank and the mandate of the Reserve Bank.
So let's ask the question why that is the case, because not only would you think that as the governing party, the ANC would listen to its membership, but one also presupposes that there would be a social compact in place that would take into account all of our views on the Reserve Bank as well. But that's not the case.
Yes, I think there should be a public debate, and also ANC members must debate this. But you're kind of a situation where the ANC resolutions are just suggestions, and every year you have these contracts, 5 years, and when you get into government, you don't do it. And what worries me is that there's a lot of fake news as to how much it will cost. Now, the Reserve Bank has got 2 million shares. There's 800 shareholders. You can't own more than 10,000 shares. 2 million shares, the last time I looked, they were trading at about 2 rands a share. So if you multiply that, the Reserve Bank is worth 20 million rand. So what I said in the article in the Mail and Guardian, I said what the government must do, it's the easiest thing to do to nationalize this Reserve Bank. You make an offer to the shareholders. I would say there must be a premium of 30 to 50 to 100%. So let's say it's a premium of 100%. Then most of those shareholders, most of them, they get a dividend yield of about 1%. So if you have 100,000 rands, you get annually your dividend is 1,000 rand. So most of those people are not there to make money. I need to interview one of them and ask them, why are you owning these shares? Is it a sense of patriotism or what? Yeah. So, but the point is, if the government makes an offer, it will cost 30 to 40 million rands with a premium. And then if the shareholders don't accept, then they go back to the branches and say, we tried our best, that's the end of the story. If some of the shareholders accept, then the government has a shareholding in the Reserve Bank. If all the shareholders accept, then it's nationalized. I don't see what's the problem. And first, the one thing that we saw at the policy conference is the head of the ETC, Duma Gqubule, she said this will upset markets. Why would a transaction that is not even on the stock exchange upset markets? I honestly don't understand this logic. So what I think the politicians are doing, the ANC deployees, are making the ordinary person scared of what would happen if we nationalize this Reserve Bank. This is our Reserve Bank. This is our public money. We must decide what we want to do. And correctly, as you say, it mustn't just be a debate for ANC members. I think it's 700,000. It must be also a debate for ordinary South Africans here.
So what if it upset the markets? Should the Reserve Bank's mandate not be focused on improving the lives of South Africans?
Yes, 100%. Yeah, they must be focused on improving the lives of the South Africans. And yeah, that's 100%. So what if it affects the market? I would say that. But I don't even see why it would affect the market, because this transaction doesn't happen on the market. This is a transaction that would happen between shareholders of the market. I don't think it would have any impact on sentiment, because every central bank in the world is nationalized. Why should it be different for us as South Africans here?
So that's the million-dollar question, because as you say, at the top tier, at a premium, if it costs the South African government 40 million rand, people own houses that are worth more than 40 million.
It's a house in Hyde Park, Camps Bay. That's how much it would cost. So the government mustn't stop scaring the ordinary members of the ANC and telling them we don't have the money. Even the resolution from the 6th Policy Conference says we must take into account the cost on the fiscus. There's no cost to the fiscus. I hate to say this, but many ANC members They can pay it out of their own pockets. The president can pay it out of his own pocket. I don't see why we can't do this thing.
So if it's not about the money, what is it about?
I think there's this irrational fear amongst the policymakers of doing things that are going to benefit ordinary South Africans. You know, Sakina, in a previous life, I follow financial markets. Even now, I used to follow them daily. And there's this irrational fear of markets and what markets will do. But countries that develop, they kind of put, ear and plug, and they listen. The Japanese, they tell the markets, yes, we're going to do this, and they do the opposite, many Asian countries. But as you said, we have to focus on the needs of millions of South Africans. We're in this worst post-apartheid crisis where half the people are in poverty, 1 in 5 people don't have enough food, and then the government is not doing anything about it. There's no plan to get our country out of this situation.
So now that we are demystifying this monster that is the South African Reserve Bank, if the government is serious about transformation or, I guess, even better, reform of this institution, where should we start?
I think we should start with the ownership, number one. Number two is the mandate, as the ANC members say at every conference, even in their manifesto in 2019. You can count 2012, 2017, 2019 manifesto, 6th policy conference. They say the mandate must be open, just like you see in the US. The US Federal Reserve. Anyone, just go and Google any speech of any US Federal Reserve chairman. They talk about jobs. They talk about inflation. Our system is out of date compared with what other central banks do. So then we should talk about the independence, and then we must also talk about the composition of the Monetary Policy Committee. Why doesn't it represent ordinary South Africans? Why do we have those 6 people who unelected bureaucrats determining interest rates? Why don't we have civil society, communities, representation on that Monetary Policy Committee? And we fight it out. If we want to say, should interest rates, why should it be left to these technocrats who serve the interests of the financial sector? Ordinary South Africans must have a say in that Monetary Policy Committee. And there are examples in the other countries. In the UK, the central bank has outside members in the Monetary Policy Committee, and I think we should do that as well.
So obviously, as you said earlier, quite apart from the markets, here internally there would be stakeholders who would probably be upset by that.
But I don't understand why. You make an offer, then you make an offer. If they accept, it's fine. If they don't accept, it's fine. It's 40 million rands. What is the big deal? I fail to understand here.
Indeed. But of course, again, in terms of that mandate, just very briefly, we speak about the independence of the Reserve Bank. So what should that mandate include? My
personal view is that our biggest challenge is unemployment in South Africa. So the mandate must say, you must look at inflation, you must look at GDP growth, and you must look at employment. Now, there's a relationship between GDP growth and employment. So we've got something called an employment multiplier. So if it's 1% GDP growth, usually results in 0.8% increase in employment. So then the third thing is employment. Then they must say, how do we increase the labor intensity of GDP growth so that the employment multiplier, we get more bang for the buck. When the economy grows by 2%, we have more jobs created. So what that requires is to shift the structure of the economy towards labor-intensive sectors. Now, when you do that, when you've got that mandate, you'll start saying, interest rates are not enough for me to achieve that mandate. Why can't I capitalize the development finance institutions to provide financing to the banks? And why don't I set targets for the banks for that kind of lending? That is what is done in Asian countries. So I'm totally opposed to this one policy tool that is inappropriate interest rates for most of the things that we need it for. So if they had this broader mandate, they would say, what else can we do to create GDP growth? What else can we do to create employment? And then they would look at, say, the cost of capital for the government. How can we reduce the cost of capital in the government, as central banks do throughout the world? They will say, we need to buy more South African government bonds on the primary market. So there's something that's called, like in Japan and Australia, it's called yield curve control. So what happens is that the central bank sets a target for the interest rate that they want the government to pay. So we could set the target at 5%, for example, and then the central bank does whatever it takes to break. They'll just keep buying these bonds on the and nobody bets against, and the markets will bet against the central bank. It's futile until that target is met. So there are many things that the central bank can do to get this economy going, because people talk about this debt crisis. If we can control if we have to get the growth up, and we have to get the cost of capital down. So the Reserve Bank can provide money to the government on favorable terms. The IMF loan, the New Development Bank loan, it's got a payment holiday for 5 years, until one has got 3 years, one is 5 years, until the economy recovers. Why can't the central bank give the government a loan like that? Say, pay to us 5 years when the economy is. Those are certain things that if you have a broader mandate, you start thinking out of the box. Now, we can't dictate to the people who we will put on the Monetary Policy Committee how they will do that. It becomes their problem, not our problem, but they must do it in consultation with ordinary South Africans.
Duma Gqubule, quite a lot for us to mull over, but thank you so much for stopping by and basically help us understand and debunk, some of the myths around the South African Reserve Bank. And love to hear your views at Morning Live SABC.